Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers of this meeting for inviting me, and the great staff that really have been really detailed in the management of this whole arrangement. I like the theme of Brave New World, and this fits, of course, well with that. Many of us, our generation at least, I think most of you are sort of my generation. Actually feels like old home week here, even though this is the first ILSI meeting I've been to. I know many of you in the room. And, you know, we grew up on Aldous Huxley and Brave New World. I think that fits with this theme of the fifth industrial revolution, because we've gotten to the point where we've actually surpassed many of the things that he was trying to envision in his book. So, first of all, I've got to do disclaimers, and the most important one here is that this doesn't represent official U.S. Army views, unless somebody else actually states that. And that's an important point, because in research, we come up with options, and then we have generals who actually make the decisions and policy decisions about how we're going to use those options and how we use the research and implement it. So in the fifth industrial revolution, I guess it's important to know what the first four were. And if we go back in time and talk about sort of mechanical in the early days and sort of our agricultural start in the U.S., and then there was sort of the invention of electricity and other things that advanced us quite a bit further into a new era. And then more recently, as this increases at a asymptotic rate in terms of the pace of technology, we've come into the digital era. And many of you are like me and might have finished a PhD thesis on the very first PC with 64K of memory. That was the digital era coming in. And then we moved into this sort of virtual era, which we see everybody checking their iPhones now, so you've got your personal electronics. And I think this fifth generation, there are different opinions as to exactly how we cast the fifth generation, but everyone talks about artificial intelligence and what massive amounts of information that you can acquire now, because we have the computing power and we have the technologies, because we always have smart engineers that will make it smaller and wearable, and they can access you wherever you are. All comes together and starts to give us all kinds of advice, decision support, and it knows more about us sometimes than what we know. MIT had done a study on some of their students where just from behaviors for how late you're checking your email and what time you were going to bed and so on, they could predict at least a day in advance, maybe a little sooner, when somebody was coming down with the flu before they knew they were sick, right? So, and we know, we've heard the examples of young women receiving pregnancy materials and advertising in the mail before anyone else knew the person was pregnant. We have that kind of information access today, and so for better or worse, this is the world that we live in and that we're moving into, and it's turning into this personalized era of information. So in the Army, we like to tell everyone what we're going to tell them up front, then we tell them, and then we tell them what we told them. That's sort of the format of talks. So we call it the bluff, the bottom line up front. And this is, sort of a dystopian view of where we're going, but, with technology, it certainly gives us more leisure time, makes it easier for us to overeat. We've got, new, better technologies even for food that give us this nice high nutrient density, and it tastes so delicious, and we don't have to work so hard, and it really seems to counter our basic biology and the way we evolved. So we've got to think about the good and the bad of technology, and the point that I want to make here is that we've got to be very directive, very thoughtful about what these technologies are doing and how we can use them to work with biology and consider what it's actually doing with our biology, in terms of overeating and especially the obesity problem. And that's important to the DoD as well, the Department of Defense, because we have a shrinking recruit pool, at least available recruits that are really qualified for service because they're already overweight and they're unfit. And so that's a big problem. This is one reason that the DoD may be one of the leaders again in this area. So there's another way to think about these revolutions, and this was Bob Langer's view of the third revolution in biomedicine. And the first one being sort of all the molecular biology advances that allowed new drug developments through the 60s and 70s. Then we had the genomics revolution, and getting the human genome was going to answer all our questions. As a physiologist, we knew as we were diminishing in our ranks that someday they'd come back with a complete genome and say, now what does it mean? Where's the phenomics and where's the physiology that goes with it? And I think that's where we are today. And then there's this third revolution, which has been described as the Convergence revolution. And it's really this focus on bringing technology and math modeling and kind of computing power and these other things into solving our problems in biomedicine. So it's a bioengineering meets biomedicine. And even NSF is focused on this theme of convergence revolution, and they look for integration across disciplines because that's where we're seeing the biggest breakthroughs. We can't just work in our little silos anymore. So how do we even know when we have a new cool technology that's worth investing in? If you think back to the early days of MRI, and it was just sort of a blob in these first publications, there are a lot of people that would have looked at that and said, yeah, but call me when it turns into something, and I'm not actually going to put my own money into that. I mean, how do you know that that's going to turn into kind of the technology that has been breakthrough technology, leap ahead for us? It allowed us, even in the Army, to look at 72-hour sleep-deprived brains. And those blue areas are the hypometabolic areas where it's not taking up glucose that correlates with performance and reduced performance in soldiers at 72 hours. Next thing would be to do that same PET study and do it with caffeine and see the compensation. I don't think we're reversing those areas. There are other areas that are being activated. So those are the kinds of studies and understanding that we can come up with now because of these new tools and advances in technology. I don't think anybody would have looked at those early blobs, though, and said, oh, yeah, this is where we're going to end up. And I know there are funding agencies that would have looked at that and said, all right, we're done, no more money to this effort. And you cut it off too soon before you've had time to really incubate an important idea. So we need a way to protect innovative ideas until they at least can mature to a level where we might appreciate what they can do. Mike Weiner has led the Alzheimer's initiative, which is this huge longitudinal study with imaging of patients as they progress in their disease and controls that go with them. And it's just amazing what we can do with this technology today and the kind of understanding that's coming out of this. There are more people in that data sharing that he set up that have published papers than the cohort of investigators that are doing this, and everyone's happy because there's so much information to mine in this. And that goes back to this AI thing. You see a paper every week coming out of the ADNI cohort. And then that's my brain on something. I was in Korea, and that's a 7 Tesla MRI that gives you this incredible quality of the image, somewhere around the hippocampus. And then a high-resolution PET scan that was done at the same time without moving my head. And then you can put them together. And so we get the metabolic and the detailed anatomic understanding of what's going on in the brain. So the opportunities for breakthrough here, now understanding what particular nutrients are going to do and all the other things, all the other questions that we have is available because of this one technology advance. So there are other things like that. Human on a chip is a great one that Don Ingber and the Wyss Institute in Boston have come up with. And there are other people that are jumping in on this, but this moves us away from animal research, but more specifically, it allows us to look at individuals. You could take your own cells and put them into this system and then understand how drugs or nutrients, how metabolism is going to be affected by whatever you want to put into the system, and also look at toxicity. And you could do that on a personalized basis. You know, we have these personalized mouse strains that are a little bit hard to develop, where you can take somebody's cells and actually blend them in with this poor living mouse. This moves away from that, and is probably even a better approach to get to the answers that we want. And you've heard about sort of developing organoids as a new model as well. So this is where some of these technologies are going that are going to give us huge breakthroughs, because now we're going to understand on a personal level what's really going on. In terms of the AI, there are all these predictive models. And, you know, AI goes back to, well, what it does is it allows us to harvest and put together all this information that we've acquired, which is far more than any one of us could keep in our head anyway, much less process and come up with an answer on the spot, when you can make predictions. So predictive modeling is huge, and that's where AI is going to take us. This is a simple model that the Army's used to predict water requirements and work-rest cycles for soldiers throughout the Army. And this is actually the simplified version of a much more complicated scenario model that we have. So this is the dumbed-down version. It gives you sweat rates, it'll give you work-rest times, and based on your predicted core temperature, with a few different inputs, like what kind of clothing they're wearing, what the environmental conditions are. That's one approach. But as we move forward, and I'll show you in a minute sort of the personalized monitoring, with personalized monitoring and sort of that input directly into the system, you get an answer for the individual instead of predicting group means, which is what this kind of model does. So we've moved ahead of this. We talk about the Internet of Things. In the Army, we talk about the Internet of Soldier Things, believe it or not. It's a little bit different, and there's more cyber protection involved. But this is all around us. You know, the first, early example of Internet of Things might be the ATM machine, where we're not talking to a teller, it's all automatic and remote, and we're interacting, and it's going back to our bank, and it's using a lot of available information to figure out, how much money it's going to dispense to you. So we've come a long way from there, and even in smart hospital and EMR, the electronic medical record, we're finally getting that organized to where the electronic medical records are going to be mineable and useful. So we're connected across the board. Everyone knows that, I think. I've got two examples from Parkinson's here of how AI and sort of big data sets are helping us either to pull apart really complicated gene-environment interactions. So, we've always made assumptions that in a trial, if the mean didn't, show an improvement, the thing failed. Well, there's some people that improved and some people that didn't, based on genomics and a whole bunch of other things that we now have a much greater appreciation for. And the same thing, especially in nutrition. I mean, you have to pay attention to the genetic background of the individuals in your study. How do you pull that all apart when you get these really complicated relationships in, the effects of caffeine and creatine and whether somebody's getting better or worse? And they can actually go in different directions. So AI is finally, and with adequate sample sizes, able to pull apart these complicated relationships that we didn't used to be able to do. We didn't even have the computing power for it. And this was a brand new study out of South Korea. I'd visited there with this one group that had access to the entire nation's 64 million, whatever it is, individuals, because they have a single payer system and it's all in one healthcare database. They still had privacy issues. So I said, why can't you do these studies? And there were privacy issues. Well, apparently they've gotten past that, and they were able to go into that and pick the over 40 population that met certain criteria, and that gave them 17 million patients to do this little study that showed that your metabolic status, metabolic syndrome, was an increased risk for Parkinson's, and there was a gender difference here. So those kinds of associational studies that you can do in an afternoon at your desktop are going to be possible now that'll point the way to new studies. That's the kind of stuff that's going to come out of AI and new technologies that are available. And the goal here, of course, would be to monitor people. You know how you're doing, and you want to sort of stay in this nice happy sort of green area, and not move into this, I'm moving towards some kind of disease state. I'm starting to develop pre-diabetes. What are we going to do about it? Well, if you wait too long, then we're suddenly treating with drugs, and that's sort of the state of medicine in the U.S. right now. What we'd like to do is catch that much earlier, say, well, these are signal markers that tell you you're starting to drift out of normal, and you need to adjust something in terms of how you're eating, probably exercise, and so on. And the goal would be to stay in this healthy zone. And this is doable with the kind of technologies that are coming out. So I'm big on accelerometry. We're investing some effort in this because there's so much that we can mine in terms of pattern recognition from the way people move that have hardly been looked at yet. I mean, I think we've just started to scratch the surface of this. And there's a whole organization, in fact, that's occupied with this. They've got a meeting coming up, so here's a free ad for them. But it's all about accelerometry. And, if you're alive, you have some kind of motion, and we can tell, even from the iPhone in your pocket, whether somebody can look in and actually estimate what you're doing, whether you're sitting in a recumbent position, if you're moving your legs, if you're actually maybe asleep. Can we distinguish between sleep and what we'd call rest? All of that kind of information is possible now just from accelerometry. And so this is going to end up in smart shoes. In 5 years, you won't be able to go into a shoe store probably and not buy a shoe that communicates with your iPhone about something. It might look at sort of your gait patterns and say you seem kind of depressed this week because you're moving in a different way, you're dragging your feet, you're starting to drop one foot, you're working on an injury, time to do your prehabilitation before you get injured. All of that kind of stuff is just about to come out, I think. Adidas has a smart shoe here that senses the surface that you're running on. So Bjorn Escoffier did his PhD on this work before he went off to lead a whole lab in this area. And it can sense when you're running on, say, concrete or blacktop, and then suddenly you move over to the grass. Within about 2 steps, it's adjusted the stiffness of the shoe and the sole properties to make it more appropriate to the surface that you're on. So that's a true smart shoe. There are other smart shoe concepts. This is one the Army's been pushing with the amount of information you could get just from a smart boot insert. And we're interested in measuring things like ground reaction forces and being able to predict when recruits are reaching an overtraining limit where they might get injured, and to be able to take some action and prevent that injury before it occurs. So what does all this technology mean? I like this top figure because we were actually able to reach back to Civil War data that was collected on nearly 25,000 Union soldiers. They had research teams that went out. Even after Gettysburg, they were interviewing them about, did you have caffeine on the road march to Gettysburg along with your hardtack, and how did that affect the pace of your march? Well, we also got all this body composition information, and they had done a lot of anthropometry. It was for uniform development at the time, but then there were some smart guys that said, well, how does that relate to physiology and health and wellness and how we would select future recruits? So we know from this data that there's been about a 30-pound weight gain, and it's in fat-free mass. There hasn't been much change in percent body fat of the people that we allow into the Army. So that's pretty stunning data, and that's the impact of the technologies that gave us better medicines and better food, better nutrition. We used to, in World War II, we were turning away soldiers that were chronically malnourished and underweight, and we didn't even have a really good way to know when they had tuberculosis. So we had a lot of underweight recruits. In 1946, Congress actually came up with the School Lunch Act, and it wasn't, unfortunately, because they really cared about our boys and girls. It was because they put in the language that it was a national security problem and that we had a problem getting adequate numbers of recruits, and we didn't want this to be a problem in the future. So the school lunch program was set up on the basis of national security. maybe we could have an anti-obesity campaign on the basis of national security, because that's the problem today. And you can see in the first 15 years or so of the Army Weight Control Program, which started in about 1984, there was this 2-inch waist circumference increase in the youngest soldiers. So this is, you know, I was puzzled. I thought, well, our weight control program must have done great things to sort of stem the increase in weight, and it didn't do anything to stem the increase in weight. Maybe that was fat-free mass. But it also didn't prevent this gain in abdominal circumference, which relates to body fat. And I was staggered by the data. My wife looked at it in about 2 seconds. She said, well, that's when the Nintendo generation kicked in, about 1984. And we have people that are much more sedentary, and they're enjoying their technology and their electronics. And it's changed our way of life, our behavior. So what is it in technology that we can do that'll reverse some of that? We can go way back to Army roots in some of these areas, and the problem in World War I, and it was Major John Merlin at the time who was inducted into the Army to set up a nutrition program, was food wastage in the camps. And they were concerned not that soldiers weren't getting enough to eat then, but that they were giving them too much food when the rest of the country was tightening their belt to make sure they had enough food. So they didn't know what the actual energy requirements were for young men. And he came up with this number which has stood up with much more sophisticated techniques since then, as 4,000 calories per day for men, young men that are working hard, like in basic training. And that's the basis for the rations that we provide even today. So this was with just energy balance studies and weight balance studies and intake studies. Techniques that we have today are things like doubly labeled water, and you're going to hear more about that in the first session here. So I won't obsess over it, except that this has really helped us understand energy requirements and some other aspects of physiology outside of the laboratory. And it's those kinds of techniques that whenever it gives us more insights outside of the laboratory in real life that we're making sort of these breakthrough discoveries. In this Norwegian Ranger training, where they go for 1 week with no food and no organized sleep, so they get about an hour of accumulated micro sleeps, because if they stop moving, they sort of fall asleep for 30 seconds and then move again. One of the observations is that corrected for body weight, men and women are just the same in the same kind of training. In the Marine training here, the training was segregated, and so it wasn't exactly matched. In this Norwegian cadet training, we did another study where we looked at the fat utilization, and the women were much more effective at accessing their fat stores. It wasn't because they had more fat, it was the estrogen effect of being able to access the lipid. And it seems to give them some additional capability that we're just discovering. I would predict that women may take over Ranger training in the future in the U.S. Army, and don't want to be quoted on that too publicly, but there really is an advantage. And if we could put a little estrogen patch on men starting Ranger training, it would enhance that endurance and their sleep resistance and the other things that we seem to see with the women. There really is a special advantage there. So there's so much more that we have to learn in terms of nutrition and metabolism in these areas, and the new tools will help us. So we're good at measuring energy expenditure. What we've always lacked is sort of the chewometer or something that's going to tell us about energy intake. And this is the latest from a bioengineer in Germany. Oliver's been doing a lot of work with these special eyeglasses that measure EMG. They're form-fitted. In fact, they're 3D printed, I think, for the individual. And again, pattern recognition. These smart engineers are able to sort of tease out what these different patterns of chewing tell us. And they can actually distinguish at least between the hardness of the food right now. They can tell if it's a banana, cucumber, or carrot when they're given a choice of those three. There's also something about the cycle of chewing, so they know that really was a meal or they were just grating their teeth while they were listening to Friedl give this talk. Physiological monitoring goes much further, and in the Army, we've really pushed this out. We've got initial versions of wearable systems that are being used by soldiers in certain types of high-risk training, like you'll see in the picture down below when they put on these special chem bio suits. They can get really hot, and if it's hot conditions outside, it's even worse, and they might be diffusing a bomb. We want to know when they're reaching their limit. Doesn't mean they're getting heat stroke, it means they're reaching their limit. They've got about 5 minutes before they're just going to have to stop or they'll keel over. So that we've already accomplished with some reliability. Now, the engineering part and the technology part is to make it smaller and better, and we can always count on our engineering friends to do that. They're problem solvers, right? They'll take whatever's available and say, oh, we can make that smaller, we can make that more efficient, we can figure out how to manufacture it. I love it when we get to the point where we finally know what we want on the biological side, and we hand it to the engineers because they say, oh, we can have that by, next week or next month. We sort of create 20 new hypotheses and problems when we do experiments. When they do something, they take all the available options and come up with a better solution. And so we're on that path to, right now we're working on something that will be body powered from body heat, phononics, and piezoelectric just from body movement. So it won't even require a battery. And before long, these are going to be implantables as well. And then we've got Joel Fink down here with this new AFOA. It's the Functional Fibers Group. The DoD just put $75 million into this. And we're going to have this shirt that's made out of cotton is going to be so yesterday in another 5 years, just like the smart shoes, where you won't be able to buy a shirt that doesn't have some sort of functional fibers in it, electronics that are controlling, sort of moisture evaporation, thermal properties. It'll be talking to your iPhone. It'll be telling other people where you are. There'll be these smart shirts. They have a way to draw fibers with little thermistors in them, all sorts of electronics, and weave those or knit those right into the fabrics. So you can make them with spider silk or Kevlar. You can make them, I saw somebody with a sweater and there was this big black component in the front. That was the capacitor with the carbon fibers that had been knitted into the sweater to make this a wearable system. So we're going to have all kinds of wear and forget systems, and some of those are already starting to come out. And there's much more than just buying a cute little wristwatch that gives you a raw heart rate, right? With AI today, what does that raw heart rate tell you? For a soldier, that'd be a real problem. You've got an elevated heart rate. Okay, maybe he's activated and ready for battle, and that's just the way we want him. Or he's on sentry duty and he's paying attention. Maybe he's hemorrhaging, and that's why heart rate's gone up. Maybe he's in some kind of psychological crisis, and that's why heart rate's gone up. So you need much more. You need the context, you need databases, you need to know something about the individual, you need the cybersecurity that's going to go with this so somebody else doesn't try to track you or do something else with it. So there's a lot that goes into these wearables that we have to pay attention to. Even as private citizens, you want to know if people are using your Fitbit to know where you are and what you're doing when you didn't necessarily want them to know that. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to have implantables in no time. This is at least 10-year-old technology and is completely possible for analytes with just something as simple as a system like this that would be embedded in a hydrogel that you inject into the skin and read with a special watch. And you could read continuously glucose. We'll probably see this in the diabetes community first. But imagine having continuous lactate, what new findings we'll have from having that kind of information. 24-hour continuous lactates when people are exercising and working hard, for example. We haven't even started to get into odor signals. The DoD has invested a little bit here. We can tell there's a discrete chemical that's secreted, that we secrete when we have an infection. And we know that from other species where, rats know to stay away from an infected rat just by the smell. Well, we have something like that too, and that's actually a specific chemical that can be detected. And there are ways that you could put this into little simple wearables and know, okay, that person's infected. You go through a lot of Asian airports and, they have these infrared cameras where they're looking for hotheads. to pull you over and measure your temperature and make sure you're not coming in with bird flu. That's a little bit crude. Imagine if they use this chemical sensing and they go, we know that you've got an infection because you're spiking on this particular chemical. This is doable, but what else are we going to learn? We send all kinds of signals through odor, and part of that's based on our nutrition as well. I think I'm almost out of time. All right. Am I out of time? Okay, so I'll move ahead. Virtual humans. This is something else we're invested in. We've actually used in treatment of PTSD as a virtual reality exposure therapy. But what's important here is that we call it PAVA. It's physiologically aware virtual agents, where we're paying attention to the physiology of the individual that's interacting, say, with Ellie on screen here. And you can go out to the internet. This is 10-year-old technology already. We're trying to take it to the next level. And Ellie is this very affable coach, and she can tell from your eye gaze, for example, with the webcam on your computer, that you're not looking at her, but you're looking all over the place today. And she'll say, well, what's going on? You seem distracted. You can get heart rate, standoff heart rate, just from coloration changes in the skin. There are a whole bunch of physiological signals you can detect, even from standoff, where that provides the input, and there's all this AI that's populated in there so that Ellie can be a useful coach and guide somebody to the right kind of help that they need. I see that as a future metabolic coach. Pennington Medical Center, Biomedical Research Center, has done a whole series of studies on weight management and tried to use technology over probably about 15 years. And this just highlights the problems of doing these real-life studies, but it gets better and better. Each one of these 3 studies got fouled up by something like Fort Bragg. They had most of Fort Bragg in the database, and suddenly there's a massive deployment and everyone leaves. That was the end of that study. The Louisiana National Guard, suddenly they have a hurricane hit when they had the whole state of Louisiana, the National Guard, randomized, controlled by parish, and then they all go to deal with the hurricane, and it mixed up all the, completely contaminated the study and messed that one up. So we keep trying. It's amazing that these researchers haven't developed a Sisyphus complex and just given up. But there's going to be a solution there with internet-based weight management. There are other things that you can do with fitness monitoring that are very simple. A smart shoe and heart rate combined could tell you over a period of time how your fitness is changing. There are a lot of these tools that we're developing. We've even got this handheld DEXA that we're trying to pioneer that we might be able to use to look for minimum lean mass, which is turning out to be as important as too much body fat. And then I just want to end with rations and the great stuff that technology has already done, even with these chemical ration heaters. That was a big breakthrough for soldiers, to be able to have a hot cup of coffee in the field by putting a little water in this thing, and it brings it almost to boiling. And the same thing with the main component. You know, the main component of the ration can be heated up. So why is that important? Well, we found out from World War II that it's not true that a hungry soldier will eat anything. You know, and we can't just give it to them in a pill, and there were all these fantastic concepts even a few years ago that we were going to pass the nutrients through the skin and, you know, we'd make this really simple. We're forgetting human biology again. There's something about eating and enjoying meals that is important even to soldiers, right? And it's such an important factor. I mean, these are just a few of my favorite food pictures from meals that I've had that, you know, go to my deliciousness center and I can actually remember the taste. But I also remember who I was with, the whole context of the meal, and, you know, the things about the way we take in food that are part of our neurobiology that can't be replaced by giving it to people in a pill. So it's all about variety. We've tried to improve the rations. There are also rations for every kind of context, even an Arctic ration I may get to try in the Arctic next month. And, you know, we're trying to be more scientific about how we do that. The Institute of Medicine, I think Allison Yates was in the audience here. She's been involved in this. There's some other people in the audience that have been involved in our committees that have advised the DoD for at least a 25-year run on, you know, on sort of the right approach to go forward. whether it was tyrosine supplements to counter the effects of stress and cognition, to what would be the right dose for a caffeine gum where the pharmacokinetics are quite different than normal cup of coffee, to the problems of soldiers not eating enough, or today the performance readiness bar that gives them a little calcium supplement and reduces stress fractures perhaps by 20% in basic trainees, just by giving them a little nighttime snack they like to eat. We're not forcing a pill on anyone. We say, wouldn't you like this chocolate-flavored performance readiness bar? And oh, by the way, it's got calcium and vitamin D in it as a supplement. So we'll finish up with, it is all about variety and maybe not even any of the specific components that we like to admire in the Mediterranean diet. And who has the least obesity? It's the groups that actually have a lot of variety in their diets. Of course, they smoke a lot more in some of these cultures too. That's actually been a problem because to quit smoking, there's a concern that they're going to gain weight, and they don't want to gain weight if the culture has become sensitive to that concept. So I like this chart that I got from a Japanese roadmap, and they're talking about sort of the fifth industrial revolution, or society 5.0. And right in there is a key element that looks at nutrition and uses biotechnology to figure out how we're going to come up with smart foods. But the Japanese also have some lower tech policies that actually they're the only ones that, like the U.S. Army, measure waist circumference on a regular basis. And companies are actually hit with fines if they have too many people that are exceeding these weight standards. So over age 40, no male can have a waist circumference over 33.5 inches. Women, it's sexually dimorphically reversed, have 35 inches as their upper limit. And if they do, they get all kinds of remedial programs. We wouldn't call them remedial. They get incentivized to manage that weight and to do more exercise and pay attention. So I'm not sure how that's turned out over the 10 years or so that Japan has had this in place, but it's a country that said, we're going to prevent this obesity epidemic because there's so many bad consequences to the problems. And we recognize that technology is a part of the problem here. We need to step in and reverse it now. So I'll end there. I don't know how over time I am, but I have to stop. Thanks very much. Thanks for your attention. Sure.
Okay, great. Wow, are we ready for this? I had mixed emotions. Well, what if the special fibers electrocuted you or something on there? But of course those soldiers want the hot coffee. I mean, my head is spinning.
Well, we're going to have a smart glove, for example, in the Arctic that tells you your hands are getting too cold, and it'll warn your.
I think I could tell you if my hands were getting too cold.
Well,
anyway.
we get frostbite in about half of the soldiers that we send up there.
Yeah, wow. Anyway, because of the government shutdown and our lack of a couple of speakers from USDA, we have a little more time flexibility than you might think from our schedule.
Oh, I've got 50 more slides.
No. What I would like is 1 or 2 burning questions for Karl. Yes.
So one of the things that you briefly covered was food intake and trying to measure food intake.
Yeah.
External monitors. Do you see any hope for a better internal monitor that might be more accurate?
Yeah. So like these implantables with continuous glucose. What would area under the curve glucose tell us about intake, or at least patterns of glucose spikes? Wouldn't that be more meaningful? Because that's the intake and the absorption and hitting the bloodstream. And so now, there are people in the Arctic, you want to munch all the time because it helps keep you warm. And if you go for a couple hours, you start to drift down and you start getting cold and you get more peripheral vasoconstriction. So that would be an example where you'd want to see people sort of with lots of frequent sort of glucose spikes because they're munching their Skittles or whatever they take. That's not so good for somebody who's supposed to be managing their weight and losing weight. You know, that'd be sort of symptomatic. This person's eating all day long as opposed to 3 meal spikes. So you're exactly right, and I think that's where it's really going to go. It's sort of cute to have these smart eyeglasses, and I think there's a lot we can get from that. There are different kinds of, you know, you could use infrared and near infrared and different kinds of visualization of the food to try to estimate how much fat is in that helping of food, but it's really, it's tough to estimate peripherally like that.
One more.
Yeah, I'm Sashikaran from India. So your data on that fat-free mass comparison in the 1800s till the latest one is very interesting. You have in the US Army the advantage that you have multi-ethnic kind of population among them. You have African Americans, you have Asian Americans, etc. So do you have the segregated data on the body composition, ethnic group separated?
Well, we tend not to segregate it so much anymore. You've got to have a good reason to actually collect that kind of information because we're such a melting pot. But of course, you do have to consider that. So when we analyzed, we participated in helping to analyze the NHANES data when we had that first, the bioelectric impedance-based body fat in a sample of the U.S. population. We split that into Black Americans, Hispanic. We didn't distinguish, you know, you can distinguish like categories of Hispanic then too, Cuban and Mexican. There are these sort of ethnic differences. But in the end, we just sort of try to put everything together and come up with equations that'll work for everybody. I think it gets really complicated when you start breaking it down that way. We are a much more sort of complicated mixing pot, and we couldn't do like one waist circumference for the entire population. The Army calculates a body fat with sort of waist, but corrects for neck and height and some other things. The Japanese can get away from it because, I think they're a little more homogeneous population still, and it kind of works. Is that a right answer?
Let's thank him again for a wonderful.
Thank you.